Now, so people who are there can see it's coming. They'll also hear me speaking, and that's okay. Hang on, folks. We're about ready to start. Here we go. It's the Formed Book Club, and we're covering today the Night of the Holy Ghost.
Clear the layer.
Wait a minute. There we go. I have, so fortunately, my technical person reminding me here that we don't just want to hear my voice. We want to see who's here. And right here in the studio at Ignatius Press, we have Vivian Dudrow and myself, Father Facio. Below me is Joseph Pierce from South Carolina.
In more ways than one, Father.
And then on your right, we have the author of this book, Dale Ahlquist, who's joining us from St. Paul, Minnesota. Is that right, St. Paul?
Well, technically Bloomington, a suburb south of Minneapolis.
Okay, Bloomington.
So we could say the Twin Cities, we could cover it that way.
All right. So this is our second session on this book, The Night of the Holy Ghost. Chapter 2, Chesterton, the writer, on Chesterton the man, had neglected to bring with her her carefully underlined copy of the book.
Very carefully.
I wanted to go back to her and let her, she might have wanted to say in the first time.
Well, I'm going to go backward in order to go forward, because one of the quotes that jumped out at me in the last chapter has a lot to do with the next chapter, and that's a quote on page 42, where Chesterton wrote, "Wherever you have animal worship, you have human sacrifice." That jumped out at me because here in San Francisco, it really is true that there are more dogs than children. That has been verified by our reliable fact checkers. And we also have...
But there's more human feces than dog feces, because you have to pick up your dog feces.
Well, that's true. But sadly, we also have more abortions than live births. And so this quote from Chesterton, "Wherever you have animal worship," you could exchange the word idolatry for animal worship. And if Chesterton wouldn't mind, you could rewrite the sentence, "Wherever you have idolatry, you will have human sacrifice." And I think that is a common theme in almost everything Chesterton writes. And I thought maybe the experts out there, Joseph and Dale, and as we go through the next chapter, we can keep that in mind.
Anything else on chapter 1?
I think we covered a lot the last time, but that little pithy
That quote,
quote,
okay,
I just
very good.
really wanted to, as a San Franciscan, I just really wanted to underline that.
First, really organizing and in charge of this whole operation, even though I sometimes may give the appearance that it's I. How do you want to proceed with chapter 2, the writer?
Are you asking me, Father? Sorry.
Yes, I'm asking you. Please.
Yeah, well, I thought that what we'd do, as we have the great honor of having the author of the book with us, and as the author is none other than Dale Ahlquist, who's certainly arguably the greatest Chesterton expert around today. I thought it might be fun just to sort of engage him in conversation, and maybe to have something that he and I have had many times over the years, an argument that's not a quarrel, to quote Chesterton himself. So in order to sort of prompt or provoke that, I just right at the beginning of the chapter of the writer, I think on page 70, if I've got this correct, he says, about halfway down that page, he was primarily a journalist, and he wrote over 5,000 essays for newspapers and magazines. So it seems to me that that I'm someone who loves literature, and I've taught The Man Who Was Thursday many times, and Chesterton's written some great poetry and what have you. That you're asking for controversy, at least if you're going to say that Chesterton is primarily a journalist. And I think I would like to ask Dale exactly what he means by that.
Well, Joseph, if you want to start a fight, we can do that. I think that Chesterton described himself as a journalist. He considered himself a journalist above all other forms of writing. And certainly he made most of his money as a writer, as a journalist. He wrote most of his writing was done as a journalist. His books and his poems and even his mystery stories represent only a fraction of his writing compared to his journalism. And so that's how he spent most of his time, and that's how he made most of his money. And I would also argue during his lifetime, that's how he made his reputation. That's how people knew him, because they read him in the newspapers. Far fewer people read his books than would have read him in the daily newspapers, both in America and in England.
Yeah, if I could just, I mean, again, it depends what you mean by the word primarily. I mean, obviously, in the sense of the sense in which you just said, no problem. He wrote more journalism than anything else. He wrote for journals, and therefore he's a journalist. He wrote some of his greatest essays, which, what's the difference between an essay and journalism is an interesting thing to discuss in itself. I would say probably the vast majority of more people read what I write in Basically Conservative than what I write in my books. And T.S. Eliot, is The Wasteland as a poem. Even if it's read far more widely elsewhere, what about the things that stand in a timeless sense as great works of literature, regardless of how popular or populist they were at the time they were being written?
Well, you have brought up, of course, the argument that most of Chesterton's contemporaries, the people closest to him, especially his wife Frances, would have argued that they said he should not spend so much time on journalism and on his throwaway newspaper writing, but he should devote himself to great works of literature, because he was certainly capable of turning out great works of literature. His wonderful epic poem, The Ballad of the White Horse, which was certainly the piece of writing he worked the hardest on during his entire life, that he spent the most time creating, and a lot of his other poetry, and certainly even some of his exquisite books of literary criticism, which I think are masterpieces of, on their own as literary works. Those who admired his writings, who were closest to him, they wanted to see more of that. That's the kind of writing that they wanted to see more of, and that's certainly what did survive. The journalism has now been rediscovered, but as we know, when Chesterton died, he stopped writing for the newspapers, and that actually hurt his career tremendously, because people stopped reading him.
Well, I'm not so sure it did hurt. I'm not so sure it did. I mean, I think his career advanced immensely after he died.
Well, it did, but he went through a period of darkness. He had to be rediscovered for some 50 years after his death, and that was at that time. When I started reading Chesterton, right before you started the collected works, Father, there were 6 of his books in print at that point.
I remember, Father, when I was on my path to conversion, you could pick up Chesterton books for 20 pence back in England, because everyone had, all the convents and monasteries had thrown the books out because this was antiquated pre-Vatican II stuff, and you could pick them up for nothing. And very few of the books were in print. So certainly a major step in the right direction is the resurrection of Chesterton.
Well, let me tell you a little story about partly how that began. At Ignatius Press, on our old office, which was a home owned by the Carmelites, right next to their monastery in San Francisco, we would have dinner once a week together, and we actually have reading at table. This is before you came along, Vivian, I believe. And we were sitting around the table, and I read an essay from Chesterton. And the question was, well, is this in print? Oh, no, this is an old book. Well, this has got to come back into print. It was the kind of seed that was planted, back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. We really have to bring this man back into print. And so we started doing that with the idea of the collected works. And I don't know when you entered the scene, Dale, but boy, you certainly been a megaphone for getting the word out about Chesterton.
Well, I had the same motivation as you, Father, because when I started reading Chesterton, my first reaction was, okay, how come I was never taught this writer when I was in college? How could I be given a liberal arts degree from a major college without ever having any exposure to Chesterton? And I started reading Chesterton, and it soon became a passion that my generation would not be cheated like the previous, or that the next generation would not be cheated like my generation was. I wanted everybody to read Chesterton.
Well, we're off to a good start. We sold thousands and thousands of copies of his books, and I mean, you've written several books on him. I know you've written at least one, Joseph. On the page that you picked, Joseph, page 70, there's another little quote I want to read to you here from Dale. He says, "To survey all of this writing in one chapter would be foolhardy and impossible. So that is what we were going to do." That's very Chestertonian.
It is indeed. And we love it. We love it for it.
Yeah.
And then go ahead.
Yeah. Well, no, I just there's something I want to address during this chapter, and it's just I'm mortified personally about the fact that Dale. I know why Dale spent a lot of time in the journalism, partly because he's been very excited and quite rightly all the discovery of all this unpublished material, and I'm really pleased that one of the great strengths of this book is the way that he actually lays out this material in a way that's not been done before. This is a unique aspect of the book. I really am completely and utterly not sideways, but the fact that there's no mention at all of any of Chesterton's novels. And I can't understand that. And I'd like Dale to explain himself.
Before he does that, though, you said you're mortified. I've never thought of you as a mortified person, actually.
Well, it takes
I mean, with all the beer you drink,
Well,
I mean, the time you spend in pubs, I think it rivals.
well, I mean,
the fact that I'm living 3,000 miles from the nearest English pub is itself a mortification, Father.
So
but
go ahead.
you've answered your own question, Joseph. I did it to mortify you, and I accomplished my task.
You succeeded. Well done.
Yeah. No, it was a horrible decision when I made that decision that I wasn't going to talk about his novels. And I really, and of course, his famous books, I spend just a scant paragraph or two about. When I made the decision to deal with him as a writer, I was going to deal primarily with the most undiscovered, but the largest portion of his writings, because I think that helps explain the man too, more, because this is what he did during the day, was write for the newspapers, both the ones he edited and for other newspapers. And I think it gives us.
Get away with it, I suppose, if we take the subtitle of the book literally, A Short History of G.K. Chesterton. So you're actually trying to show us who Chesterton was. But but for me, sort of an overview in a chapter called The Writer, to not mention the fact that the writer was also, in my opinion, my humble opinion, a very good novelist. That was it's an oversight. It's nonplussed me.
Well, I am so pleased to know that.
Yeah.
Well, if I too, Dale, truth be told, I too found it a bit of an oversight. However, since you were sort of focusing on Chesterton the prophet in particular, I can see why that's another reason why the focus is more on his essays and journal entries, because that's where he is the most prophetic, really. That's where he makes so many of these profound insights into what's happening in society and the trajectory that we're on. And I can see why that's where kind of your passion lies, why that's sort of where your focus went.
Well, I thank you for saying that, Vivian, because I did try to point out that even though he was writing for newspapers, which are, of course, the throwaway item, the thing that you wrap the fish in, the fact that these essays written over 100 years ago can be so timely and so on the money for what's going on in the world today, I think is one of the most astonishing things about Chesterton. And certainly the literature can be picked up and read over and over again because it is timeless as well. But the fact that journalism can be timeless, I think that's one of the great tributes to Chesterton.
Well, I know Dale, when we began to publish in the collected works the Illustrated London News, a fellow from Notre Dame who had all the printouts of the thing, Larry Clipper, I think was his name.
Yeah, he was from Indiana University, Father.
Indiana. Sorry,
It's in the same state.
I didn't mean to disparage him.
Yeah, all right.
Hey.
But it was in the same state.
Yeah, same state.
And I was going through these long printouts, reading these things, thinking, well, these are, articles in the Illustrated London News about, World War I and, the Queen doing this and this economic. I thought, well, that's going to be pretty boring. Honestly, I remember thinking to myself, I never came across one single article that didn't have something timeless in it. I mean, it was just, he would begin with some event, but then he would put that into the context of eternity. I mean, it was just amazing. Going to the book, your first section here is on books. 71, you say, with a book like Orthodoxy, it doesn't compare with anything, which makes it so much like Chesterton's other books. That's another beautiful Chestertonian paradox, but it's true. We're all unique, but everything he wrote was unique. I mean, it's amazing. He's like a fountain of novelty. You never get the same thing twice.
And all of his books are hard to categorize. They're hard to know which section to put him in, and that's been one of the problems with Chesterton not being taught in universities, is that it's not clear which department he should be taught in. I mean, Joseph has it easy because he can teach the novels in the literature department, but what about the rest of his books? Where do you put a book like The Outline of Sanity?
Well,
there's not a clear place to put it.
I mean, he is a university in the sense that it comes from Latin uni versus, to be turned towards the one, to bring all things into a unity.
Here.
Yeah, once we divide university into a bunch of faculties and disciplines and subdisciplines, well, then you're trying to carve up Chesterton. Fortunately, there's enough of him that you can carve him up in all those faculties, but nevertheless, it's a problem. The next book you mentioned is What's Wrong with the World. And I like that because, as I recall, you can tell me if I'm wrong or not, that at some point he says, well, I found out what's wrong with the world. It's me.
Yeah, that's that did happen, but it didn't happen in that book. Okay. Everyone assumes that story is connected with that book, but it's not.
Was that book a collection of things from other places?
No, that book was written as a book. It was not.
Oh, it was.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either. I always assumed it was a collection of things, but okay.
Well, you say, Chesterton says on page 73 here, Chesterton says there are four main things wrong with the world: big government, big business, feminism, and public education. I mean, well, that's really dated, isn't it? Why are these the things that are wrong with the world? ? Because they all undermine the family, which is the basic unit of society, the thing that must be stable for society to be stable, the thing that must be strong for society to be strong, is most under attack in our society today. It's sad that the attack has gone on for over 100 years, but it's there.
I would say as well there, Father, that this actually is an example of Dale Ahlquist writing at his best, because that's beautiful English, it's very good rhetoric, it sums up the issue succinctly, and who would have known that Dale Ahlquist had it in him?
Yeah, it's astonishing what you can do when you've had a couple glasses of wine.
Well, that's why I produce it, want to plenty on hand. In his book on Thomas Aquinas, page 79, at the top of the page, you say, we're living the legacy of what Chesterton calls the morbid Renaissance intellectual, who says, to be or not to be, that is the question. But Thomas says, Aquinas says, Chesterton replies in a voice of thunder, to be, that is the answer. That's fantastic.
Yeah, that is great.
It's very good. I would have to say that the morbid imagination intellectual Hamlet did actually come to the same conclusion as Chesterton by the end of the play.
Yeah, and I would agree with you there, Joseph. But don't tell anybody that I agreed with you, okay?
Okay, well, I don't think anybody's listening. It's just
And for
between the
poor
two of us.
Hamlet, and for poor Hamlet, it came a little late. That's why it's a tragedy.
Well said.
I'm looking here at the Illustrated London News again. And I get to page 104. And does this remind anybody of anything? Nowadays, neither voters nor representatives are watched at all because the whole thing has become too complicated and secretive to follow. And because everything depends on interviews and intrigues and unrecorded conversations and unofficial compromises. Things are not watched because there are 1,000 evasions by advertisements and suggestion, by false news and fictitious biography, and under cover of these things, men we cannot restrain pursue aims that we do not know. Well, there's a little more openness now. Things are being published, but what we're finding out now is kind of like when I first learned how to clean to gut deer. You know, hunting deer, and you cut them open and you start to take out the insides. I mean, this is a lot of stuff in there, you know, a bloody mess. And that's what we're seeing, I think, in the newspapers today about our political situation.
And how about the fact that he uses the term false news?
Yes. I know.
Yep, false news. Enough of it.
Do you have any underlined there you want to talk
I've
about?
got so much underlined. I'm in a state of I'm dizzy with so much to underline. But you know that quote, Father, that you just gave, and that was Chesterton that you were quoting.
Yes.
Which work is that from, Dale? That was
Illustrated London
News.
That's the Illustrated London News
In the 1920s. And so in our last conversation, we talked a little bit about Chesterton's ideas about democracy, and that it wasn't democracy per se where the problem lies, but when democracy gets too big. Right, Joseph? Isn't that what you clarified when I asked a question about that? You mentioned that. And I think we see here a little bit, this is a little ideas fleshed out a little more by Chesterton himself, that you might have a democratic form of government, but if it becomes this big, complex Byzantine mess, it's kind of hard to have self-government.
Yeah, I mean, like for instance, I mean, in the European Union today, the one vote is just one person voting amongst hundreds of thousands for one MEP. You are essentially voiceless. The whole mechanism has become so distant from the ordinary person, the ordinary family, the ordinary locality, even the ordinary national government, that the whole thing has just become macro to the level of madness.
Well, related to... Sorry, Dale, go on. You answer that.
I was going to say that Chesterton's criticism, of course, of big government also applies to big business. When he prefers a local government, but he also prefers, as much as possible, a local commerce, because then you can control what's happening, and just as you want your elected official to be close, he says, close enough to kick him, close enough to be accountable. You want the local businessman to be accountable too, and it should be your neighbor that you're doing business with. And when you have a centralized commercial system and a centralized government that are far and remote, people just totally feel like they've lost control of their own lives.
Right. There was also the note that Chesterton made about democracy. Where is that quote? About when the abnormal becomes normal. That's another peril for democracy. I think that's on page 112.
And I tried to make that point in the chapter that's one of Chesterton's goals, one of his missions was to try to defend the normal because no one else was defending the normal.
Yes, he says somewhere the normal man has no voice.
Right.
Because the abnormal, and so that's what happens when these become big and corrupt and
Chesterton also says that's one of the problems with journalism is because the news only reports the abnormal. So we get a skewed version of the world because we only read about the strange and the bad. They only report the murders. They don't report the people who are not murdered.
Right. Right.
You mentioned here a few different places Chesterton's distributism, and I don't want to get off on a complete discussion of that.
No one ever does, Father.
It was impossible. It's true. But I've always summed it up this way because I think you have to have a certain number of large businesses. I mean, you fly once in a while, and it's pretty hard to have a mom and pop airline. But what you want to have is the maximum number of small businesses and the minimum number of large businesses. And the large business should be, controlled by a lot of different people. That's what stock is supposed to do. It doesn't always work that way.
Let me point out, though, of course, that airplanes were invented by a couple of bicycle builders, though. Okay.
Well, yeah. So computers were invented in a garage somewhere too, but now they're all over the place.
And, yeah.
Things multiply.
Yeah, there's such a thing as economies of scale, but to the point about not letting things get too large, that's why this country has antitrust laws. And I think in Chesterton's time, looking at the economic landscape in his day, I don't think England did have antitrust sorts of laws. Not that they're applied as they should be, but they're there because that's an American value. Smallness was an American value in the beginning. Whether it still is or will be remains to be seen.
Well, actually, when Chesterton started G.K.'s Weekly, one of his primary goals was to fight monopolies. That's that was a stated mission of the newspaper, was to fight monopolies,
especially in making beer.
Well, I mean, beer is a perfect example of why you don't want monopolies. Everybody knows the local breweries are better than the large ones where they. I'm not going to go into.
That's the whole point. Aristotle said that there's a correct size for things. It's not something that doesn't necessarily have to be small, but some things are better on a small scale. Beer's an example. Cheese an example. Obviously, aeroplanes is not an example. But I think you summed it up very well, Father. That the society is healthier in direct proportion to the proportion of the businesses that are small and human scale and actually respond to local needs and needs of the family. So you do have to have some big companies, and when you have those, then you need to democratize those ideally by having what's known in this country as ESOPs, employee state ownership plans, which is a way that you can actually have economies of scale and still have distributism, what E.F. Schumacher called smallness within bigness.
Here's something I'd like to get your comments on. You mentioned it as a very important part of Chesterton's work and his thought, namely the problems that come when you take the man out of the home and make him a wage slave somewhere else. Now, here we have Vivian's husband works with her here at Ignatius Press. They live in their home, but they actually work together too here. And their children have worked there, part-time from time on. Joseph, you can work from your home. Dale, you can work from your home. So we're blessed in that. But is there even a possible solution in our society today of separating the man from the home in order to the family?
Well, I think that there is a possibility with the technology we have now. The reason that I can work for the Augustine Institute in Denver from South Carolina is that with the various different computer things now, I can meet people face to face via the internet as we're doing now. And it should actually be possible for people to be working from home again, because the necessity of commuting to some big hub where all the men get together to do work and do business needn't necessarily be the model in the future. So it is possible that actually new technology can assist in the revitalization of the family.
Dale?
Well, I totally agree with that. I think, though, that in those companies that require people to work at that company, Joseph talked about the ESOP solution, employee ownership of those buildings, but of those companies. But those companies, it would be great if if they could be more community based, so that the people could live and work in the same place, and you don't have people commuting an hour to work. And that's the sort of thing that has had a really detrimental effect on our urban areas, is by the huge traffic patterns that as we continue to expand these urban areas, they die in the inside, and then they are an infrastructure spreading out into the countryside, and people still commuting for hours every
I would
day.
say one thing there, though. I mean, I speaking locally in Simpsonville, where I live, when we moved here 2006, downtown Simpsonville had become a complete ghost town. And now there's all sorts of new small businesses and boutiques, coffee shops, pubs, breweries, all sorts of things opening. And we used to go into Greenville, which is 20 miles away, to go out because there was nothing to do closer. And now we go around the corner 3 miles away to the local downtown. So I think even then we're beginning to see the tide turning. I don't really think that it's all doom and despondency. I think we do see some things moving in the right direction.
The tide is turning. The surveys of millennials and how they want to live, they don't want to live in outer lying suburbs and McMansions. They actually want to live in town centers, in smaller places, use mass transit or bicycles. The trend is going back the other way.
And I think that is happening because that is the only possible solution to return to sanity, is something like that.
Yeah, insanity is unsustainable, basically. That's what it boils down to. Yeah.
Well, our office in San Francisco, I feel very blessed here because we're in a little residential area, but within a 2-minute walk, I can have everything I need. There's a hardware store, a drugstore, an optometrist. There's 40 restaurants, and almost every one is mom and pop. San Francisco has a lot to disrecommend it. But one thing is an advantage is they believe in neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods have a tremendous amount of influence in whether business comes in. We temporarily lost Joseph Pierce. I think I brought him back. Okay. Joseph Pierce.
What a pleasure to be back from the dead. Thank you, Father.
Yeah, it was just a big question mark there, but
Now, the counterfeit to this, though, is what some of these big tech companies are doing, with these huge campuses in Silicon Valley. And you practically could put a cot in there and live there. There's food, there's childcare, there's health care, there's egg freezing for women who don't want to have babies right now. It's as if they want to control your whole life. And it's this sort of seductive siren song. We're going to take care of your every need right here at Amazon or Apple or whatever it might be. And, that's sort of a counterfeit for what we're talking about.
Well, I think that along with this revival of small town centers and local communities, one of the things that is bound to return is going to be the local bookstore, because so many of those have closed because of our friend of the river in South America that has flowed over everything. And but people have to, one of the reasons we do talk about these things that Chesterton was so impassioned about. I mean, he spent the last 11 years of his life writing about these things very passionately, is that we got to turn things around and get them going in a better direction. And but that means making some decisions about the way we spend our own money, the way we buy things, and the way we choose where we're going to work and how we're going to work. And that's what Chesterton was writing about, especially at the end of his life.
exactly. And I think that's one reason why it's important for people to read Chesterton. It's a breath of fresh air. It's sanity. It's clear common sense, but expressed in a way that is striking, and it gives you a standard by which to measure your experience, a way to look at the world where you're not absorbed and consumed by the world, but standing back a little bit. I mean, he allows us to do that. So that's
Can I just say something? I think another great strength of Chesterton's is we live in an age, we see this amongst our fellow Catholics, an age of increasing anger, an age of decreasing charity. And I think what we see in Chesterton is the way that he managed to talk about all of the problems in a way that was always good humored, always charitable, always uplifting, always edifying. So he never left reading Chesterton fulminating and foaming at the mouth about what's wrong with the world. You left thinking, well, I'm wiser now. I know there are good men out there, and I want to be one of those good men, and it's all positive. And I think in our day and age, where we have this negativity reigning, even in our own church, that I think Chesterton's a great example for all of us.
Yeah, I find it a little irritating myself, but
Well, that's because he had those. That's because he had those childlike qualities. You know, he had gratitude, he had joy, he had wonder, he had a mirthful, goofball sort of side to him. I mean, that's, I think, the antidote to taking yourself too seriously and letting anger and despondency and disgust basically take over your psyche.
Yeah, I think
Well,
when C.S. Lewis, when C.S. Lewis talked about when he first read Chesterton, he said it was like falling in love. And he said that although he was an atheist at the time, it was Chesterton's goodness that he actually fell in love with. And I think I see that in myself. And when I read Chesterton, I was a very
you
angry
see that
young
goodness in
man.
yourself?
Sorry?
You see that goodness in yourself?
I see the C.S. Lewis in myself, for good or ill. No, I mean, like Lewis, I was very angry when I first read Chesterton. And Chesterton led me in the direction of charity and love, while still, looking at the problems of the world. So not dampening or dulling, but on the sharpening my sense of social justice, but allowing me to do it with a sense of charity.
Well,
I just
the question is he a saint? And we'll cover that next week with Dale again here with us. But before we conclude today, Joseph, will you now give us some preview of the next book and what we should do, where we should buy it and everything?
Yes, indeed. So we have, obviously, we have another 2 weeks with Dale, and we're very blessed to be able to have Dale with us over the next couple of weeks. But then the book after that, which you should be thinking about buying now, is the first in a new series produced jointly by Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute. And the series is called What Every Catholic Should Know. And the first title we'll be discussing in that series is Salvation, What Every Catholic Should Know, by Michael Barber, who's a theologian at the Augustine Institute.
All right. Therefore, any last comments? I think we're ready to call it for this week. See you all next week. God bless you all.
thank you.